Hello and welcome to Transatlantic Retro. If you were a child of the 80s, you may have had a Commodore 64, a ZX Spectrum, or a CPC 464. A lot of us seem to be picking up these machines once again, but our minds are hazy. What were the good games on these machines? Some people have never even played them before. What's a good game for the newbie? First we're going to start with the Commodore 64, and I've got help from the Hermit's Hideaway, Benny Williams. Benny's going to tell us some of the games he enjoyed when he was a kid, and the top 5 games that you should play if you're new to the Commodore 64. All this and more on Transatlantic Micro. We're going to try something a little bit different on Transatlantic Retro, a series of mini episodes about 8-bit computers. Growing up for British people, these were the mainstay. Forget your NES, we had Amstrad, Commodore and the Spectrum. So for this mini podcast, it's just me, RetroTech 100.
And me, a Hermit's Hideaway.
Talking about 8-bit computers from the 80s. First, we're going to start off with the Commodore 64. Now, I've just recently gotten into the Commodore 64. I've recently got one this week. So, I'm wanting some recommendations on Commodore 64 games. And the only other person I know who plays them currently is Benny.
I do indeed. I had a Commodore 64 as a child. I think I got it when I was about 4 or 5 years old, so it was my first home computer and first sort of, I guess you could call it video game system as well, if you like, can't you? Because it does the same sort of thing anyway. But it was my very first computer and video game system. And I distinctly remember especially having the wood grain TV for it in my bedroom, and I remember the colours being so vivid on it because they were just so bright. They must have only been so bright because looking back at it now and seeing that actually the actual colours that you get from not only emulating it but also when you're playing on the actual hardware, they're not as vivid as I remember. And I think all it was down to is just the colour and contrast being turned all the way up on the TV.
So, did you have the Commodore 64 in its heyday, or did you have it slightly after it had waned? Because
it was slightly after its heyday because it was released sort of like 82 or something like that, I think it was. I wasn't born until 84. It wouldn't have been until 88 that I started playing it when I was 4. So, quite a few years had already gone by. I mean, it was still obviously very popular, but as far as I know, because I tried to ask my mum what she recalls about getting it, how she got it, where she got it from, because it's quite an unusual system for us Brits to have, isn't it? Because it was obviously the Spectrum and the Commodore 64 was so expensive, and, thinking about all those sort of things, I tried to jog my mum's memory a bit and try and get her to remember how she came about getting it, if she paid full price for it or what. But I think she bought it off a friend that was getting rid of it, and it had a bundle of games with it. And I was very lucky with the games that I got because most of them were just the great games and the heavy hitters on the system.
The 8-bit micros had much longer shelf life than the consoles that came after it. The Commodore 64 came out in 82, 83, and then it went on to the early 90s, so did the Spectrum. They tried to shut down the Commodore 64 line, but Commodore had to keep making it just because people wanted it. So it went on for ages. I think it was the highest selling computer ever, the Commodore 64.
And that sound chip in it has got to have really helped in that, hasn't it?
The sound compared to other machines, I mean, if you listen to the Spectrum, I love the sound of the Spectrum. It's nostalgia in a bottle, but it doesn't sound anywhere as good as the Commodore
sometimes
64.
It's quite often just like clicks, isn't it?
Yeah.
When the character moves, whereas you get that in the Commodore as well, but there's quite often music to complement it as well and sound effects.
Seems like the music is what everybody remembers about the Commodore 64 the most.
Yeah.
I think the colour palette, when you look at it now, is very hued. It's very browns and oranges.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I mean, it's not as vivid as I thought it was when I was younger. And it's the colour palette. I mean, there is better things out there, isn't there? Like the Amstrad had a much better colour palette. And like I said to you once before, for me, it almost feels like the Amstrad's almost like the perfect hybrid of a Spectrum and a Commodore 64.
See, now, I had an Amstrad, I had a CPC 464, and I got mine late. But what I always remembered was, I used to go to the newsagents to buy my games. The Commodore 64 games always looked better on the box. But when you look back at the games, they had a much wider title range than the Amstrad. But the Amstrad has a completely different look to the Spectrum. And a completely different look to the Commodore 64.
But it's sort of in between now as well,
Yeah,
isn't
it
it?
is. It's like
This is what I mean.
definitely
It's like
the
that
hybrid.
that perfect hybrid sort of marriage between them. It's like their love child a bit in a way, if you like, isn't it?
They're all good in their own way. And
Mm.
we're gonna pick out 5 games that you'd recommend to a newbie Commodore 64 owner or emulator.
One thing that I love about the Commodore 64, which you find when you get into it a bit more, is it's really, really good for the ports of arcade games. It's very impressive for its time and the way they ported them over. There's obviously games like Ghouls and Ghosts. They did Donkey Kong Jr. on there, which some of these are still getting support and remakes again from homebrew developers that are doing it now, and they're starting to find out how much they can push the system towards its limits because they pretty much know these systems inside and out now, and it's just incredible to see what they can churn out nowadays. So going with the theme of arcade ports to start with, I've got a couple on here that I've got picks for 2 games that I'd recommend, and the first one is one of my all-time favourite games. It's just almost arcade perfect. There's a lot of different versions for it, and it was a multi console computer release. It was pretty much ported to everything, and it's none other than Rainbow Islands.
Yeah, it's a great game. Nearly on every system.
Yeah.
Do you think it stands out from the other ports, or do you think it's pretty faithful to the arcade?
I think it's pretty faithful to the arcade. I mean, like you touched upon earlier, that the colour palette's not quite there. It's almost got its own sort of style as well with the colour palette. It sort of makes it different enough to give it that little bit more charm. But I think one of the closest to the actual arcade that I saw was, I think it was the PC Engine version and the Sega Saturn version. And interestingly, with the Sega Saturn version, I think they've got some parallax scrolling in it as well on the background animations with clouds and things.
One thing the Saturn could do was parallax scrolling, but I mean it was a lot later than the Commodore 64 version.
It was,
time to
absolutely.
work on it. It should have looked a bit nicer.
But I just remember, it's just got that classic tune to it, which sounds like it's just ripped straight out of the Wizard of Oz or something like that. And it's just got really colourful characters. It's a great platformer, which you're not only going from side to side, but you're scrolling upwards at the same time. And there's just so much going on in the game, and it's a bit of a collectathon because you've got to collect as much fruit and gems as you can. Obviously in the same style as Bubble Bobble, because it's known as Bubble Bobble 2, isn't it? Rainbow Islands is.
Yeah.
So it's in that sort of same setting, and it's obviously by the same people that did. But you get so many levels. I think there's about 6 levels in each world before you fight a boss, and it's challenging enough to keep you going and wanting to go back to it. And one of the reasons why I think it's so essential is because I never feel that it's a game you can ever get bored of, because it's got so much charm to it and things like that.
I think what's good about the micros and the Commodore 64 especially, they might not have had the pixels to push, but the controls were always tight, and replay value is especially important on micros because you don't want to be reloading the game or loading another game because you got sick of one. So I feel like we always went back to the games we liked, like Rainbow Islands, because we didn't want to load in the game, and if it was tight and good, we'd stick with it.
Absolutely, you're right, yeah. So how often how much have you played Rainbow Islands? Have you put much time into it? And what were your thoughts on that game?
I think I used to pop in and out of it, but mostly I had it on the Master System. So I used to play it mostly on the Master System. But I always found it a lot tougher than Bubble Bobble. So I used to play Bubble Bobble a lot more. Because I was never good at games when I was a kid. I'm still useless. So it was a bit on the tough side for me, and I'd get a bit narked. But I play it now, and that's 25 years later from when I started playing it. I mean, I'm no better, but I do enjoy it.
You touched upon something quite funny there, actually, because I was thinking about it earlier and I thought about it before, that I used to be able to get so much further in some of these games, especially the Commodore 64 ones when I was younger, than what I can now. And I think it was just down to sheer determination and only having about 15, 20 games to play, and that was your lot, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Whereas nowadays, you can take your pick. There's so many different games to play, and you can get a 2 gigabyte SD card for an SD to IEC for your Commodore 64, and you could put, every single game that's ever been released on the Commodore 64 onto 2 gig. So we're really spoilt for choice nowadays, aren't we?
Yeah, I try not to, because you don't get the most out of a game if you've got so many games and you get bored after 30 seconds. You've got to give it more time than that. And yeah, I mean, when we were kids, we had all the time in the world to play games. We used to come home, ignore my homework, and just play and play and play till I had to go to sleep. And then sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and carry on playing.
Is that where you get your nocturnalness from then, is it?
Yeah, my dad had to cut the bloody plug off my Master System when I was a kid. But
I think I remember you saying that.
I didn't let that stop me. I put the wires into the plug socket, and then Wonder Boy kept going the wrong way. I must have fried something.
Brilliant. Is it the Master System version of Rainbow Islands where it's sort of set at night?
I can't remember. It's been that long.
Because I know it's one of them, and I think it's either the Master System or the Mega Drive one. And I think the NES version one, instead of it being a sort of static screen that only moves when you move up when you're ascending, I think it's the screen follows the character. So when you're going left to right, the screen moves as well.
Oh, I bet that's just strange to play.
Yeah, that's really weird, that is. I haven't actually got it on the NES, but, I used to think to myself that, I wouldn't particularly want to get the same game for multiple systems, but for things like that, it's well worth doing, isn't it? Because especially when you come to, especially going off topic a little bit here, coming to Super Nintendo and Genesis or Master System or Megasys, as we like to say, the games are quite often entirely different if they've only got slight similarities in them. So it's always worth, I guess, owning multiple copies, and especially just emulating them to start with to see which one you prefer, or you might have a game that you don't enjoy, that you might enjoy it more on a different system because of the way it controls, or it might be a bit more graphically pleasing, or it might be a bit quicker.
Yeah, I think coming back to that moving, scrolling background for Rainbow Islands, my preference now is to play a lot of single screen games like Manic Miner and stuff. I think that my mind can't deal with much more than that in a short period of time. And if I have to overthink something, I end up changing game, because as adults, we've got far more on our minds, and we don't want to be dealing with too much going on. I guess some people are different, but for me, I just have to be focused.
No,
on
I agree with that.
It doesn't move very much.
And plus, the beauty about that is that you could play several games in half an hour to an hour, can't you, and enjoy it far more.
That was always my preference as a kid. I was always an arcade gamer. If I'd pick up a game, I'd try and pick up an arcade version of a game rather than a long drawn out game. I never had the interest for long drawn out games, even as a kid.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, I'd rather short replay value. I mean, I was playing R-Type the other night, and I just kept playing R-Type.
What a brilliant game!
Yeah, I was playing that for loads, and
great Master System port as well.
Yeah, I think I had it on the Master System. I was playing the Amiga one the other night, and people say it ain't the greatest port, but the music out of it's amazing.
Yeah, well, I've found with that again, it's the same where the different ports. I think on the Commodore version of R-Type, I think when you get to on the first level where you get to the area where you sort of go into the corridor from out in the outside, and then you've got those rotating bots that you got to shoot. I think on the Commodore version, the bots are static and they don't move. So it just goes to show that, the restrictions I had to deal with, but it still looks the part, and it's still really pleasing to look at and play.
Yeah, I think I prefer the restricted versions of games. They're seem to be more inventive,
a little bit easier.
Yeah, and a bit definitely a bit easier, unless you're playing a crack version, and then you can have unlimited lives and stuff. So let's move on to your next game that for the Commodore 64 new users should be playing.
So it's another arcade game, another arcade port that's done very well, and it's Load Runner.
Load Runner. I've never played Load Runner.
Load Runner, basically, again, it's sort of like a platforming maze type game, if you like, in a way. And it's a static screen. Basically, you get platforms and you've got ladders. You've got these small bars that look like tiny bars of soap that you've got to pick up. And you've got 3 to 4 men on each screen. Basically, these men are trying to catch you and stop you from getting around the screen. So, obviously, when you get hit by them, you die, you lose a life. You've got to try and avoid them by dropping off a platform, climbing up a ladder, or you can hit your... It will be your fire button on a Commodore joystick, and you can put a little hole in the platform, like you remove a brick, if you like, from out of the floor, and then the enemy will come along. So you've got to sort of try and think which direction they're going to come from and how much time you've got, because once they start coming down, the others will start going the other way and try and block you in. So you can remove a block from the floor, and then once he walks over that gap here, fall down. He basically fills in that hole that you where the block was with his body, and then he sort of becomes a temporary block where you can just walk over him.
Seems like a lot of strategies involved in Load Runner.
Yeah, a lot of strategy is involved, and it's just very clever. It's quick paced. It's got a lot of replay value because you always want to get further than you did before, and of course, it's the different screens and the different layouts are more than inventive enough for you to, again, not feel bored and want to come back to it and play it over and over again. And it'll be also a good game whereas Rainbow Island's quite a lonely sort of game that you'd only tend to play by yourself. I think with Load Runner, it'll be a bit more fun to challenge your friends to see how far you can get with it and to see if you can beat each other, get as far as you can and things like that. So it's a really, really fun game. It's a great port.
Excellent. So it's not a two-player game as such, but you'd be chasing a high score of your friend.
Yeah, I think so. Or just trying to, get one up on each other, trying to see who can get the furthest. And it's one of those type of games. But yeah, it's a really fun game. I've enjoyed it when I've played it, and it's definitely one that I do tend to go back to. Especially, it works really well on the bar top arcade as well, actually.
So it works well with arcade controls as well as a joystick.
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to stay faithful to playing Commodore 64 games now. I've got a Commodore 64, although I am using a Mega Drive pad, which is a bit, But I must get a cheater 125.
Which that's a good point, actually, talking about that, because we were having a little bit of a chat about controls on an arcade, and you was having a little bit of trouble trying to map the controls, weren't you, for the Commodore 64 emulator for the Vice?
I was
the built-in emulator.
It was very awkward. I tried it a while back, and what stopped me playing Commodore 64 was the control scheme. Every time I tried to set it, it wouldn't set. But luckily, I know a guy who knew how to set it, so I just followed Benny's instructions, and now it's all set. So I'm going to load up some ROMs onto it. I've already been playing Commando 86. I thought I was going to be playing Commando. I ended up putting on Commando 86, and it plays a bit like Rambo 3 on the Master System.
Yeah.
If you've ever played that, and it's funny that because it's very playable and very straightforward, and the tanks are the same size as you, which is interesting. But I mean, I had to pause it and do something. I keep coming back to it. It was really fun.
Yeah, that's the beauty about the emulating it on the Pi, isn't it? That you can sort of pause it for a bit and come back to it. It's not technically pausing it, but you can sort of there's a configuration that you can do, isn't there, where you could pause it for a minute and then come back to it.
All I do is I hit the button to come back to the Vice menu, and I just leave it there, and then I come back.
Yeah, and then reopen it again.
X out of the menu and back into the game.
Yeah.
That works really well.
About the control system, I had trouble trying to sort that out myself. It's nigh on impossible if you don't know what you're doing. And as I was saying to you earlier, that I tried Googling it myself, and I really struggled to find anything on forums, anything like that, people tips or videos on YouTube of people that have actually done it.
Yeah.
So it was just really difficult, and
I've seen a few videos. I saw a few videos I couldn't follow. So Benny, on the Hermit's Hideaway, you should put a video up because yours was very straightforward to follow.
I should do. That's a good point, actually. Yeah.
So,
good idea, that man.
I think a lot of people appreciate it, especially people who've got 4 Commodore 64s, a spare Raspberry Pi 2, and are going to make a marriage with an individual computer's Kira version 2, because I like to have. I'm going to have an image with all the 8-bit computers on. Now that you've helped me start the Commodore 64, I've got Atari ST sorted out. I've got Amiga kind of sorted out. Yeah, it's very straightforward. The Atari
you can
ST.
help me out with those then, actually.
Amiga, I run WHD load inside Amaberry or Amibian, and it works pretty well. There is graphical glitches, but it does give you a taste.
It's not going to be perfect, though, is it?
It's not. I mean, even though, it's running like 1,000 times more power, you're not going to be able to emulate it quite correctly. But a lot of the games play really nice. Soccer Kid plays nice on the Amiga on there, and all the platformers.
Such a great game that is.
So many good platformers on the Amiga, it's unreal. I'm just starting to chew through them now. And what else did I get running? Spectrum runs really well. Although, for a lot of these emulators, you do need to have a keyboard. So, building it into an old Commodore 64 or Atari 400 XL, something that you can get a keyboard emulator for, works perfectly. So that's the best way, I think, to deal with these emulators that aren't console. It seems to be the best way. Because if you've got a Kira, which you hook to the keyboard and the power inside, say, a bread bin, a Commodore 64 bread bin, and then you can plug a joystick into them. So it's got 2 joystick ports built onto this USB powered board. And if you don't want to plug a Raspberry Pi, you can actually use the keyboard as a USB keyboard for your computer.
Great tip.
I think they're a bit on the touch on the expensive side. They're about 30 quid.
Yeah.
But, I mean, if you're really into micros and you don't want to have 9 all around you at once, then I think it's a good way to go.
Like yourself.
Yeah, I seem to be acquiring a few, all right. It's definitely...
You're doing really well in such a short amount of time now. Was it 6 months that you've only been really collecting for again?
Yeah, and it's really ramped up the last month. I've just... I had a couple of lucky finds, should I say. I traded up and up. The Amiga I'm sending you has completely shit the bed for some reason. I got it out today, and I put it, not today, a couple of days ago, and I'm just getting a red screen. And so if anybody knows what a red screen on an Amiga 500 means, please let me know, because it was working at one point.
Never mind, it's just the way these things go, isn't it? They've probably been sitting in storage for so long. You try them and they work first time, sort of kickstarting, and then it's just like, oh, never mind, I'm not going to work again for a while now.
I think I warmed up the capacitors, and then they decided to. I mean, it looks fine, but I'm only just fumbling around of what these machines are now. I've got 4 Commodore 64s to look at, bread bins, and now I've got a nice working one that I traded for. These will probably move on to a friend of mine who knows far more than me.
Yeah.
What's the next game you'd like to
my next
recommend?
one, I don't know if this is an arcade port or not. I probably should have had a look and seen if it was, but it's Bruce Lee.
Bruce Lee. I played this on the Spectrum.
Yeah, and I think it plays pretty similar to the Spectrum version.
Probably an updated graphical look, though.
Yeah, but the good thing about the Spectrum is that the sprites are nearly... They're normally better than the C64, aren't they? For actually looking like it. Not granted, they don't really have the colours of it, because it's normally just a black outline with the Spectrum, isn't it?
Generally, or a lovely colour clash at some point.
Yeah, yeah. But they normally get the look of the sprite right, or the outline of it at the very least.
Yeah, I think once you're used to it, or you See, I never had a Spectrum as a kid. I had an Amstrad. And so when I'd see a Spectrum, even 5 years ago, I thought it was crap. But then when you play the games, it's got its own charm. It looks different from everything else, so you get used to it, and then you end up enjoying the look of it. But back to the Commodore 64 version.
Well, like I say, it's probably fairly similar to the Spectrum version. I've never played the Spectrum version, but you basically have two enemies that run towards you, and you just got to constantly be on your feet and try and avoid them. You have some moves where you can jump, you can do a flying kick, and there's normally things around the screen. Again, it's a static screen, and you go from screen to screen, but there's normally platformers, ladders, and you got to sometimes collect are they like little bells or something like that, I think it is. I
mean, I've been playing it a bit. I still really don't know what it all means. I'm just quite enjoying it. Plays nice and tightly on the Spectrum, and that's so I'll go with it because I really like Bruce Lee as a person. Anyway. So I thought, well, Bruce Lee, he must be good. And it was.
Yeah, it's a fun game, and it's sort of like an action platformer sort of thing. And obviously, it's just got a bit of fighting involved in it. And they did do Bruce Lee 2, which I think I played before Bruce Lee, which was also really good. And that was more like it's more the same sort of thing, but a bit more adventure platforming in it as well.
Yeah, Bruce Lee doesn't strike me as why it would have a kind of a platformer style to it. You think it would be more like IR Kung Fu. But it works well.
You would think so, yeah. And of course, there's some puzzles in some of the levels that you got to try and work out, or you got to try and think about how you're going to fall into a gap. And of course, the first time you fall down, you find out what's down there, so you sort of think, well, there's a ledge down there, so I'm going to try and aim for that ledge. And there's a ladder over the other side, but there's water at the bottom, so I'm safe. But if I stay in the water for too long, I'll drown. And then you think, but I need to get to this ledge, drop down to this ladder, but then there's a big gap for me to get over to get access into a tunnel. And, it really makes you think, doesn't it?
It's what I like about these 8-bit micro single-screen platformers. They're little mini-games in themselves. One room is a game to get to the next room, to get to the next room, and I really enjoy that.
It's definitely another one I'd recommend, and of course you've played it anyway, but I'd also, like I say, recommend you trying out Bruce Lee 2 as well.
Yeah, I'll have to have a go at
Bruce Lee 2. Certainly want to add to your list. It's a very, very good game. It's a lot of fun. Again, a lot of replay value because you just want to try and beat where you got to the last time, and it's quite addictive as well.
Excellent. It's getting a long list. I'm going to have to write these down.
So, next choice, it's a new game that was released in 2016, and it's just absolutely graphically stunning. It's an action platformer adventure sort of game, and it's called The Bare Essentials.
Yes, I've seen bits and pieces about The Bare Essentials, but I've never actually seen it running.
I did a gameplay of it on the Hermit's Hideaway.
Yeah, that's probably where
so if anyone wanted to go and check that out, and you just see how gorgeous it is, and just again, like I was saying earlier, how pushed they can make, or they can get past some of the limitations and make it almost look like an NES game.
It's crazy even to seasoned Spectrum coders and Commodore coders what the new kids and younger people are able to get out of the machines that they used to code on all the time. Who was the guy? I'll have to cut this bit out. I can't remember his name anyway. There was a seasoned guy, and he says he couldn't believe what they could get out of the machine was unbelievable.
Yeah. It's like I said to you though, it's because these people know them inside out now, don't they? And they're dedicated so many years doing it. And yeah, I wish that when I was younger, I'd read the Commodore 64 book and learnt to code and stuff, and learnt a lot more about it, because I'd have a bit more knowledge about it now, and I just never did.
I tried. I mean, I did the type-ins from my Amstrad book, But I never
That
got.
was right, because
Yeah.
it's those where you make the games from typing in
It
things.
wasn't as much games as it was just a book because you could get magazines used to have type-ins.
Yeah, that's right.
But I never knew there was any magazines for micros when I was a kid. I didn't start buying micros till I got into kind of the Mega Drive phase. But
Yeah.
I've got my Commodore 64 book, so I should have a rake in that. I did the type-ins, but like you get so far and then you mess up and it takes you so long, you get sick, and there's only the really hardcore kids used to keep going,
Yeah.
and they're the ones with all the money now. So.
Well, the Bear Essentials is basically, obviously, you're a bear, as the name suggests, and it's coming towards winter, and you've got to get, I think, something like 364 apples that will feed your family and see you through the winter before you go into hibernation. Basically, again, static screens. You go in, and you get different platforms that are quite often made out of mountain terrain or trees and branches, and you've got these really cute looking enemies. And this, as I say, this game wouldn't seem out of place on the NES at all. It would look lovely on the NES. There's apples scattered across each different screen, and you've got to work your way around the screen trying to get the apples, a bit like Bomb Jack in a way, if you like, where you've got to collect the bombs. Except you've got the enemies that they move about, they move at different paces. So you've got a snail, which will move quite slow, and then you've got a crow, which will fly a bit faster. And you just got to try and it's there's a lot of reward in patience and learning the game.
Yeah.
Which is key to replayability, and you just got to time your jumps right. The collision detection on it is almost spot on. It's perfect.
Yeah, some new games that I've been playing for the Spectrum, the collision detection is terrible, and it's really aggravating.
Really?
Yeah. I was thinking, there's 2 new Monty Mole games that came out for the Spectrum. One is Monty Mole and the Temple of Souls, which the collision detection is painful on. Is the Bear Essentials, is it a scrolling game, or is it room by room?
No, it's room by room, static rooms, and you basically you'll have anything between 2 to 4 sort of doors or holes on each area where you'd have to walk into to get to the next screen. And it's very, very cleverly done, because again, you normally scroll left to right for most of the levels, but on some of them you start scrolling up, you jump up vertically as well, a bit like Rainbow Islands. So you'll go from a lower screen to a higher screen, and then on top of that you could still go left to right on some of the areas.
That always confused me on games like Manic Miner. I didn't know that you could drop down and there'd be another room below. I just thought you'd die.
Yeah.
So
think it's a pit of spikes or something like that. You fall in. Yeah, but there's lots of different areas. There's a jungle area. There's a mountain area. There's a treetop area where you got to climb up the tree branches to get right to the top of it. And for most of the different areas that you get, like the jungle and the mountains, you sort of get a sub boss in each area as well.
Oh.
A lot of thought went into it. It's just an absolutely brilliant game. It is one of my favourite Commodore 64 games that I've ever played, bar none. It is absolutely perfect. I'll give it a 10 out of 10.
Bloody hell. That's impressive.
It really is.
So if you like apples and pixel pushing platformers, you should try the Bear Essentials.
It is absolutely fantastic. You won't be disappointed.
Oh, excellent. The 2 Monty Mole games I was thinking of where the collision detection was trouble, Monty Mole and the Lost Souls is kind of, it's a platformer, but there's lots of hidden things. You have to unlock stuff, and the collision detection is terrible. And Andy Johns made that game. I think he's tweaked with it since. I mean, it's impressive looking, but it's very annoying. Yeah. It's like it really punishes you for being slightly off. There's snakes, and there's snakes that go for you. But the game I really liked was Monty's Honey Run, and that came out previous to Monty Mole and the Lost Souls. And that's one of my favourite games on the Spectrum, and that's only been out.
Did Andy Johns do that one as well?
Andy Johns did both Monty
Oh,
Moore's games.
cool.
Yeah, they're excellent. If well, I know we're not talking about Spectrum now, but they will pop up again. I can tell you.
Yeah.
Keep it to Commodore.
It's okay to go off topic a little bit or go onto another system.
I do tend to go off topic. I don't know if anyone's noticed.
All part of the magic. So for my final choice is going to be Space Taxi.
Space Taxi? Never heard of it.
Space Taxi. It looks like it should be an arcade game, but I don't think it was. I think it only came out on the Commodore 64, and I think it was also had a Spectrum release as well. Basically, the idea of this, again, static screens, and you've normally got numbers sort of like 1 to 5, and you'll have a character. You've got your taxi, which hovers about like a bit of a spaceship, but it's in the shape of a taxi. And it's really cool because it's got a speech in it as well.
Really?
And someone will go, "Taxi!" So you've got to move over to the person and pick them up, and then you get different platforms on the area around the static screen, and ask you to take them to a number which is sort of like 1 to 5.
I'm looking at
so
screenshots.
they might just say number 3.
Yeah.
So you'd have to take them to number 3, and there's sort of obstacles there sometimes, or you don't want to fly too close to certain platforms or things like that.
And so is it kind of is there gravity involved? Are you fighting against inertia when you're using the controls?
I can't quite remember, to be honest. I haven't played it for a while, but I do have fond memories playing it. But it's also one of the more rarer games on the Commodore 64. See, the actual cassette, the actual physical game, will set you back quite a bit of money.
Oh, don't worry about that. If you want to play the game, RetroPie's there for you, and Vice.
Yeah, but I don't think you're restricted by gravity and things like that. I think I think you've got a time limit, and you just got to try and negotiate it quite well.
I'm looking at some of the screenshots, and the screens are very different from one to other. There's
yes,
large variation. Yeah.
And again, I think it'll be another one of those that'll be appealing to having a little competition between your friends. To, it's one of those a bit like Load Runner where you could just take it in turns to have a crack at it.
Was that something you played when you were a kid, or is this something you found recently?
When I was much younger, it was either on a compilation tape or I had a copy of it because I didn't have the original cassette of it.
I've heard nobody speak of Space Taxi, so maybe this is a hidden gem.
No, it's absolutely a hidden gem. I don't think a lot of people would know about it, and as I say, it is a very rare game for the Commodore 64 as well.
You're very good to remember the games you played and all these Commodore 64 games you played as a kid, because I couldn't remember any of my Amstrad games that I played.
It's so funny because normally my mind's quite hazy, especially from my childhood. I don't tend to remember a lot, but of course there was key games that I do remember that I had. I remember having Terminator 2 Judgment Day, which that nearly made this list, but it's just for the pure fact that a lot of people don't like it, but I absolutely loved it. And Terminator 2 was my favourite film of all time anyway, and
mine too.
Being able to just a stunning film, isn't it? And so far ahead for its time.
I've seen it so many times.
Yeah, it never gets old, never gets boring.
And why do you think people didn't like the game?
I think it was because of the difficulty of it, but it had. What I liked about it is that you start off, you're fighting the T-1000, so it's sort of like one-on-one fighting, and it's quite funny because the character's movement's quite limited, so instead of walking over, they almost shuffle over to each other in a way. But you can kick, you can punch, you can block, and it's quite frustrating to master those moves because you've obviously got to press fire and hold. You've got to hold in the direction, press fire, and things like that. So it's quite difficult to master it. And then on the second level, you're on the motorbike going through the viaducts or aqueducts, whatever they're called.
Yeah.
And you're chased by the T-1000 in the lorry. and it's a bit like Paperboy, that is, because you know it's you're going you're going up the screen and you're on your motorbike and you got to try and avoid obstacles. You could jump over little ramps and things like that. And for its time, it was just so clever. It was really cleverly done. As I was saying, I think you fight the T-1000 again, and after that, there's a really difficult bit where the screens in between are stunning for its time. You basically got the hand of is it T-800?
Yeah.
Arnie, isn't that? You got his hand, and it's not working, and it's a race against time to try and get all the digits working in his hand again, because you know where in the film his hand comes off, and he goes to Skynet to get the new hand, the new arm to put on.
Yeah.
You got to get that repaired and working again. And it's so difficult, that bit is. I've never got as far as that because I normally died there. But after that, you're in the prison then, and you've got to break out the prison. And then I think you're in a helicopter then, trying to get away from the T-1000. So there's so much to it. And, you know, it's one of those games that's so worth people going back to and playing it again and seeing it if they can get further.
Lots of different game styles, a bit like RoboCop, you know. Was it on the Amstrad where you got a driving section and then a shooting section?
Yeah, definitely.
Stuff like that. So I always like games like that.
But I had so many great games. I had the 4-in-1 where you had clacks on it. I think there was a football game on it or something like that. Fiendish Freddy's Big Top of Fun, which was so much fun. Have you ever heard of that one?
No.
Basically, it's you're performing in the circus, and it's sort of like it's very tongue in cheek because it's all like mutilation and things like that. It sounds really bad, but you know, I think they just got away with it back in those days, and you know, you basically everyone else on the circus tries to kill you off in it, but you start out doing a high dive, and you're diving into this big massive pool, a big massive tub of water, and the higher you dive, the smaller the tub gets until it becomes a little glass cup, and you got to try and as you're going down, you could perform these moves where you can sort of do this magic carpet sort of move, and then you got some of the clowns trying to push you off target and push you away, and it just gets harder and harder to try and hit your target. And if you make it all the way to the end with the glass cup, the head lands inside the glass cup, and then it sort of just shrinks a bit like one of the creatures off Beetlejuice, where you got the big body and small head inside this glass jar. It's really funny, tongue in cheek.
It's unusual that would be such a dark game.
Yeah, and there's another one where you're on a unicycle and you're juggling knives and things like that. And there's tightrope walking where they try and throw blades at you. So you got to not only have you got to try and navigate, keep your balance going over the tightrope, you got to tilt your stick to try and deflect the blades from cutting you in half.
Lots of different games to be had on the Commodore 64. I'll tell you a brief history of my childhood with the Commodore 64. It was walking past Tandy's every day. And every day I would see the Commodore 64 night moves back in the window of Tandy's when I was 10 years old. And I couldn't go any other way to school, so I had to look at it. And I always walked past it, and I always wanted it. And now, in a couple of days' time, I'm getting that exact box to put on my shelf.
Great stuff.
It only took me 27 years to get.
So that's something that I would love to have back again, the Terminator 2 Judgment Day version of the Commodore 64. But yeah, I'm happy with the one that I've got. It's not the one that I did have, but that one came with the Terminator 2 Judgment Day white cartridge.
So there was... See, this is a thing I never remembered, that there was cartridges for the Commodore 64.
Yeah, there's loads that you can get. No, you could get loads and loads.
I'd love to pick them up. I
They're
didn't.
quite expensive though.
Yeah.
That's why I've never, I had a chance of getting Terminator 2 Judgment Day a couple of times, especially Play Blackpool when I was there. But I didn't have a Commodore 64 at the time,
That's the
I think
thing.
it was about £8, so I passed it up. And I regret not
I'm
getting.
always the way that I end up picking up games before I've got the machines, and I think,
Yeah,
shall I, shan't I? When I was at NERG, I was going to pick up Sega Rally for the Saturn, and I don't even have a Saturn yet. I'm saving for a Saturn. But yeah,
so expensive now
cartridges.
though, aren't they? Start from £90 for the Sega
Yeah,
set.
well, that's CEX prices. But if you're gonna buy them, so Retro Game Trade is a good place to go and buy a box one, 50 or 60 quid, which isn't too bad.
So yeah, as you were saying, there are a lot of Commodore 64 cartridges you can buy, but they sort of every now and then you see them on the Facebook groups. They sell them from sort of like £10, which is really good. But I've never got the money at the time, of course. But
That's
for a
always
lot
that
of
way,
them,
yeah.
they start at £15 upwards on eBay.
See, that's the thing with micros. If you can buy the hardware and emulate the software so easily. People shouldn't be put off by owning the hardware and not being able to get the games, because for the Spectrum, say, I run a tape like you used to use in the car, and it has a 3.5mm wire, and I plug that into my phone and I load the game straight into it. Is that possible to do on the Commodore 64?
I don't know. It's quite possibly. I've never tried it or looked into that, to be honest. But I've got the SD to ISC flash cart thing for it.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people. So that plugs into the cartridge port, does it?
Yeah, well, it can either. There's different versions of it. There's one that goes into the cartridge port, and then one goes into the dataset port.
Cool.
So you could get there's two different versions of cables that you can get for it.
And
the only thing, as good as that is, the only thing that I don't like is that you've got to switch your Commodore 64 off and on every time, rather than just being able to press a button and going into a menu index and choosing your game from there.
Yeah, it will be stress on the power supply and
yeah,
the
definitely.
capacitors for sure.
Which I think they've sold that in the later version of it.
So it will be something I'll be looking into, but for now I've got loads of demos to play, and I've got 3 data sets, so if one doesn't work, I've got another 2.
Well, I'm glad that I've got a data set, because I did pick one up from the car boot, as well as I think I picked up the power supply and 2 joysticks. £10 for that I paid at the car boot. So I was really pleased with that, because I would have paid that for probably the power supply alone, wouldn't I, really?
Yeah.
So I was quite pleased with that. But a couple of years ago, I got some Commodore 64 game tapes from some of the retro events, and I've recently purchased some from Cytronic Software on the Binary Zone store, which at the moment I've been waiting for 2 weeks for them to come, but I found out that the person that deals with it has actually been on holiday.
Yeah, when you wanted to buy new games, if you're living in Britain and you want to buy new tapes, it's generally run by one fella. I mean, if you want certain leads, and the guy's sick, you're going to be waiting for your leads. But I mean, that's half the. It's very niche compared to the wider range of games consoles. So you're going to be waiting, and you're going to pay a little bit more. And it's definitely important to have spares for all your bits and pieces, because micros tend to shit the bed a lot more than, say, consoles do. Well, cartridge-based consoles anyway.
Definitely, mate, definitely. And it's, it'd be worth the wait in the end, because I'll have physical copies of these games. Yeah. And the good thing is that these 2 that I'm getting in particular, I don't think you can get the ROMs for them online, so you can just try them and play. But while I'm waiting for them to arrive, I've got links to the ROMs to play.
Oh, that's
because
nice.
I've technically bought the games, so it's a bit like with the Sky Store now for films, where you buy a film and they're sending you the DVD in the post or something. Sometimes it's a bit like that.
It makes it
so
more
you get
special.
A digital copy of it while you're waiting for the games to arrive. So
if you think now you can download any ROM, so to have to wait for a tape, even I bet some people even though they got access to the ROM, they'll wait because they want to relive the way it used to be, where you'd have your tape.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, some of the magic for that is loading the tape, isn't it?
Yeah.
Seeing the
People say I hate loading, but I mean, it's not like you can't do anything else now. You can go on your phone or watch YouTube while it loads.
exactly.
I just have my Spectrum like loading away, and you get that R tape error, and you think, oh well, and you reload it again.
There is options. You can get fast loader cartridges as well.
Yeah.
So there are other viable options out there. The beauty about emulating is that you can use warp mode.
Yeah. I don't know anything about the Commodore 64. A lot of the Commodore 64 emulation is brand new to me, like the Spectrum was 6 months ago. So I like that I don't know. It makes it more fun. It's like with this Amiga business. I don't know about a lot of the great games, and looking them up and reading it, it just brings it back. Like when you were a kid, you didn't know anything and you learned, and that was what was fun. So that's Benny's top 5 games. Let's go over them for the Commodore 64 newbie.
So the first one was Rainbow Islands, and then it was Lode Runner, and then it was Bruce Lee, I believe.
Yep, and Bruce Lee 2. Have a go at that.
And Bruce Lee 2. The Bare Essentials, which I did mean to mention a minute ago, actually, when we was talking about when I said about getting my cassettes off the binary store of these games. There is a physical cassette version being made of the Bare Essentials. They've done a disc version, which is really cool, really nice, and it's high quality stuff, and it's got Vanja Utni of Pon Software is a really, really great coder. She makes her own games as well, and she also does illustrations and things, and she's done a gorgeous cover and design for the artwork for it, and I think she's put it all together herself, the cassette. So I've got a pre-order of that, so I'll be receiving it soon, so look out on my YouTube channel for that. And then finally it was Space Taxi, which, as I say, admittedly I haven't played it for quite a while, but I do have fun memories of it, and it's something that I know everyone that does play it really, really enjoys it and loves the game, so that's why it was on my recommendations.
So that's a hidden gem. We'll have to go and have a crack at this. Definitely. And all the other games.
So that was my top 5 recommendations for the microcomputers for the Commodore 64.
So if you're new to Commodore 64 or Commodore 64 emulation, give these 5 games a go. We'll be back next time with a new micro, probably the Amstrad, because I'm an Amstrad head.
And I'm just getting into it as well.
See you next time.
See you next time. Keep it retro.
Keep it retro.